One of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War was America's role in supporting Afghan warlords known as the Mujahideen. The official story is that America backed these fundamentalists in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. But that's not true. It was 6 months before the Soviet invasion, in July of that year, that President Jimmy Carter authorized $500 million to help set up the Mujahideen, a terrorist organization. The American people were completely unaware that their government, together with the British Secret Service, MI6, had begun training and funding Islamic extremists, including Osama bin Laden. Out of this came the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and September the 11th. Soon after the Taliban came to power in 1996, the administration of Bill Clinton backed a secret plan for a pipeline through Afghanistan from Central Asia, which has vast reserves of oil and gas. The Taliban were offered a generous cut in the deal and secretly invited to Washington and Texas. They were treated royally, taken shopping and flown to tourist attractions like the NASA Space Center and Mount Rushmore. Their tour was so secret that no television news covered it. Most Americans knew nothing. By the time George W. Bush came to power, the link between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban was an embarrassment, and September the 11th gave Bush an opportunity to get rid of them. Today, Afghanistan is run by a regime installed by the Americans, and the pipeline deal is going ahead. September the 11th also presented an opportunity to an influential group who, even by Republican Party standards, were extreme. Ray McGovern is a former senior officer of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and a personal friend of George Bush Sr., the president's father.
The same people who are running U.S. policy now are people that the president's father kept at arm's length. They were referred to in the circles in which I moved when I was briefing at the top intelligence and policy levels. They were referred to as the crazies. The crazies. I mean, you talk about the crazies, everyone knew who they were. Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, those folks.
The crazies also include Donald Rumsfeld, seen here in Baghdad in 1986, warmly greeting Saddam Hussein, who was then being armed to the teeth by America and Britain. This is one of their blueprints, published in 2000 by the extreme right-wing group Project for a New American Century. The US military will fight multiple simultaneous wars as the cavalry on the new American frontier. The principal author is William Crystal.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved in conflicts.
Outside America, people have worried about the United States conducting an unprovoked attack on a country, a sovereign country.
Are they? Are they?
Yes, they are.
Really? They're worried we're going to attack Britain, France, Germany? Any democracy?
No, because...
Any decent regime?
No, the United States doesn't usually attack strong countries.
Do we attack decent countries?
No, I said strong countries.
Well, I'm asking decent countries.
I don't know
Are
what
people
you would
really
call,
worried the U.S. is going to go, a decent, law-abiding country, and the U.S. is going to come in and say, we don't like the look of you, we're going to depose you? Is that something the U.S. has done quite often? How many countries has the U.S. attacked in the last 15 years?
Well, since World War II, there have been 72 interventions by the United States.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
That's ludicrous.
Well, it's not ludicrous, it's true.
These are some of the countries where the United States, directly and indirectly, has overthrown governments, manipulated elections, and attacked popular movements since 1945. Bush's war on terror is just another brand name replacing the Red Menace as justification for a systematic aggression. This is well documented. Yet it remains a kind of secret history, seldom reported in the West, as a war of terror.
I think we can all agree that ISIS is the worst of the worst.
They're more extreme even than Al-Qaeda.
A savagery unseen.
This is an evil, sadistic, monstrous enemy.
But the truth is that there would be no ISIS had it not been for the American-led invasion of Iraq, because ISIS is blowback. Remember 2003? We won the war in Iraq. A brutal dictator was toppled, Iraqis celebrated in the streets, and George Bush declared mission accomplished. But of course, it wasn't, and in fact that mission led both directly and indirectly to the founding of ISIS in 2013. How so? Well, to start, foreign military occupations breed violent insurgencies. They always have, they always will. Within weeks of the fall of Saddam Hussein, US soldiers had morphed from heroic liberators to brutal occupiers. In Fallujah, which would later become an ISIS stronghold, US troops opened fire on a crowd of peaceful protesters, killing and wounding dozens. At Abu Ghraib, the US military rounded up hundreds of Iraqis, many of them completely innocent, and tortured them in horrific ways. The shootings, the torture, the general chaos helped drive thousands of Iraqis, especially from the minority Sunni community, into the arms of radical groups led by brutal gangsters such as Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the same groups, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISI, that would later coalesce into ISIS. Next, in a criminally stupid and self-defeating move, the US occupying authorities disbanded the Iraqi army overnight, a move that shocked even senior Bush administration officials back in Washington, D.C.
This idea to disband the entire army was one that came as quite a surprise to me. We had a lot of out-of-work soldiers.
Yep, 500,000 or so Iraqi men, not just unemployed and pissed off at the Americans, but well-trained and heavily armed. Overnight, they became what Colin Powell would later call prime recruits for insurgency, as one ludicrously eloquent and informed college student told President Bush's younger brother Jeb not so long ago.
The threat of ISIS was created by the Iraqi coalition authority, which ousted the entire government of Iraq. Your brother created ISIS.
Today, it's no coincidence that much of the top leadership of ISIS consists of former top officers in Saddam's army, or former army. Now, I know what you're thinking. How did secular Baathists, Saddam's people, end up fighting alongside Salafi jihadists? Well, the answer again is blowback. The US helped introduce them to one another. Which leads me to my last point, Camp Bucca. That's the name of the post-war US detention facility in southern Iraq, in which around 100,000 Iraqi men were held. Again, many of them were completely innocent. It's where jihadists, ex-soldiers, and yes, ordinary Iraqis met, networked, recruited, and radicalized in what a Camp Bucca guard would later call a pressure cooker for extremism.
What Camp Bucca and other military facilities ended up being luxury radicalization centers.
It then became a management seminar for upper echelons of ISIS.
There were large numbers of people who weren't against them in the first place when they went into Bucca, who were very much against them when they were released.
Oh dear. One former Bucca detainee was none other than Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. You might have heard of him. He's the founder of ISIS. Yeah, that guy. According to Iraqi terrorism expert 𝗧𝗿𝗶𝗁𝗱𝗄, the loathsome Baghdadi got more radicalized while in US detention, where he, quote, absorbed the jihadist ideology and established himself. Thanks, Camp Bucca. To recap, the US built, ran, supervised a recruitment center for the guys who would go on to create ISIS. Madness.
Him and others were able to write their contact details on the white elastic of their boxer shorts, their prison-issued boxer shorts, and that was a way that they networked.
As one former ISIS commander told The Guardian, if there was no American prison in Iraq, there would be no ISIS now. Bucca was a factory. It made us all. It built our ideology. Now you might say, of course an ISIS commander is going to blame the Americans for everything. Of course he's going to say that. But it isn't just him. Listen to David Kilcullen, former advisor to both General David Petraeus and Condoleezza Rice, and widely considered to be one of the world's leading experts on counterinsurgency.
Biggest strategic screw-up since the invasion of Russia by Hitler in 1941 was the decision to invade Iraq in 2003. There undeniably would be no ISIS if we had not invaded Iraq.
Ooh. Listen also to the former President of the United States.
ISIL is a direct outgrowth of al-Qaeda in Iraq that grew out of our invasion, which is an example of unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences, aka blowback. But the current President of the United States has his own theory. He's claimed ISIS is a result of the withdrawal of US forces from Iraq by Obama in 2011.
The way he got out of Iraq was that was the founding of ISIS. I mean, with his bad policies, that's why ISIS came about. If he would have done things properly, you wouldn't have had
That's
ISIS.
true.
Therefore, he was the founder of ISIS.
As is so often the case, Trump has it backwards. It wasn't the getting out, it was the going in.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
There was no ISIS in Iraq before we invaded. We helped put ISIS in Iraq and beyond. Yes, the Iraqi government's corruption and the Syrian government's repression also contributed to the rise of ISIS, as did a vicious Salafi jihadi ideology funded by some in the Gulf. But you can't get away from the original sin of 2003 and the blowback from that invasion. So when it comes to the world's worst terrorist group, remember, we sowed the wind, and now we all reap the whirlwind. The Palestinian militant group Hamas has carried out brutal acts of terror against Israeli civilians, and Israeli and American leaders are always keen to tell us how dangerous and evil Hamas is.
The inhumanity of Hamas.
I have no sympathy for Hamas.
That keep shelling Israel with thousands of rockets and mortar shells.
But what if I told you that Israel helped create Hamas? Officially, Hamas, which is the acronym for an Arabic phrase meaning Islamic resistance movement, was founded in 1987, at the start of the first Palestinian Intifada, or uprising against the Israeli occupation. But its roots were planted much earlier. The Hamas founder Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was a half-blind, disabled Palestinian cleric and member of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood had been repressed by the Egyptians in Gaza prior to 1967, but once the Israelis invaded and occupied the Strip, they didn't just turn a blind eye to these Islamists, they encouraged them. See, the Israelis, especially right-wing Israelis, wanted to undermine the power of the dominant Palestinian political force at that time, the nationalist PLO, at the heart of which was the secular Fatah party of Yasser Arafat, their bête noire.
بغصن الزيتون في يدي وببندقية الثائر في يدي.
By empowering Sheikh Yassin and the Muslim Brotherhood, Israeli leaders thought they could divide and rule the occupied Palestinians, play them off against each other, secular nationalists against religious Islamists. So in 1978, when Yassin wanted to officially register his Islamic Association, which was basically the precursor to Hamas, the Israelis were only too keen to help. Yassin built and grew a network of Islamist social institutions across Gaza, including schools and clubs and mosques, and Israel helped fund some of those projects. Most American politicians have no clue about any of this, although the former Republican Congressman Ron Paul once made this point on the floor of the House.
Hamas was encouraged and really started by Israel because they wanted Hamas to counteract Yasser Arafat.
Arafat himself told an Italian newspaper, quote, Hamas is a creature of Israel. He even claimed that former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin admitted as much to him, calling it a fatal error. Now, you might be wondering, why should I believe mad Ron Paul or the famously shady Yasser Arafat? Well, you don't have to. You can believe top Israeli and US officials who've basically owned up to all this. Brigadier Yitzhak Segev, for example, who was the Israeli military governor in Gaza, and later told a New York Times reporter that he helped finance the Islamic movement. The Israeli government gave me a budget, he said, and the military government gives to the mosques. Colonel David Hakam, who worked in Gaza in the late 1980s as an Arab affairs expert in the Israeli military, has admitted that the original sin was Israeli support for Yassin in the late 70s. But at the time, he has argued, nobody thought about the possible results. Well, Avner Cohen did. Cohen was the Israeli official who was responsible for religious affairs in Gaza for more than 2 decades, and who now says, quote, Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation. Yeah, Cohen's words. He actually wrote an official report to his superiors in the mid-1980s, warning them not to play divide and rule in the occupied territories and calling on Israel to, quote, break up this monster before this reality jumps in our face. But no one else on the Israeli side really took the possibility of blowback seriously at that time. They never do they? Hamas has since killed far more Israeli civilians than any secular Palestinian militant group, and its leaders have been pretty viciously anti-Israeli and even anti-Semitic in their rhetoric.
لن نعترف بإسرائيل.
لا مكان لكم بيننا ولا مستقبل لكم بين الأمم إنكم إلى زوال.
Sheikh Yassin would eventually be assassinated by an Israeli airstrike in Gaza.
Sheikh Yassin and its organization, the Hamas, are responsible to the killings of more than 400 Israelis. So the question shouldn't be why now. I think it should be why not before.
Why not before? Well, because before, Israel was actually nudging and winking at Yassin and co., building them up as a rival to Arafat's Fatah. The die was cast for blowback. Blowback, incidentally, that they decided to double down on when they assassinated Yassin.
You can hear the crowds chanting for Hamas, and any idea that this operation would actually suppress or diminish that organization seems to be ill-judged.
The inconvenient truth is that Hamas is in part a creature of Israel's own making, an enemy that Israel spent more than 20 years helping to build up, and then spent the next 20 years, the past 20 years that is, trying to bomb, besiege, and blockade out of existence. The 3 Gaza wars fought by Israel against Hamas since 2008 killed around 2,000 Palestinian civilians and a dozen Israeli civilians. That's the real human cost of blowback. David Long, a former Middle East expert at the US State Department under Ronald Reagan, told journalist Robert Dreyfus, "I thought the Israelis were playing with fire. I didn't realize they'd end up creating a monster. But I don't think you ought to mess around with potential fanatics. It's a lesson both the Israelis and the Americans never seem to learn, though. And as usual, innocent people, in this case Palestinians and Israelis, continue to lose their lives as a result."